your attention, we'll get started. I want to welcome you to our second day of our Cyberbullying Symposium. We are really eager to hear the speakers. We've got a great lineup. Today, my name is Philip G. Peter Jr., and I'm your moderator. I teach an experimental course this year in education reform law, and I'm as eager as any of you to hear what our speakers today have to say. The ground rules, our questions will come after all the speakers have spoken, and we'll be asking you to go to the mics on either side of the room in order to ask your questions so that we can record them. Our speakers today, starting from your left, going to your right at our table today, start with Philip Rodkin, who is an associate professor in child development at the University of Illinois. He's in the departments of educational psychology and psychology. Dr. Rodkin's expertise, his work, is in children's social relationships during elementary school. He's paid particular attention to bullying between boys and girls and between the relationship between aggression and being bullied. Look forward to hearing those remarks. To his left is Melissa Holt, who is an assistant professor in counseling psychology at Boston University in the School of Education. She's an expert on youth experiences with violence in the home, in school, and in the community. And she too has emphasized in her work the study of bullying. In addition, she's looked at how school-based programs can be used to reduce violence. Following Dr. Holt will be Mark Small, professor at Clemson in the Department of Psychology. He's also associate director of their Institute for Family and Neighborhood Life. He has published widely with grants from federal agencies, state agencies, and private foundations across a range of subjects, ranging from families and child maltreatment to community development and justice. We look forward to hearing his remarks. They will be followed by a brief remark by Josh Oxenhandler, who will be here talking about a film that's going to be in town it's called Bullying. And that will finish our panel. So, with that,
All right, well, good morning. Thank you so much, Professor Peter, Professor Abram, Professor Wells, and Ian for making this really such a wonderful and well put together conference. So I certainly appreciate the invitation to come in and speak to you this morning. I want to start by just giving a little bit more context about the history of bullying, and in particular that Ovea's definition that has come up time and again, and then from there, can't hear? Okay, and then from there I'll make some extensions to cyberbullying. Now, as in so many other areas in psychology, the story of the study of bullying is really one of tragedy and response, where researchers have been reacting to
you any better?
Can't hear? Okay. Where researchers, is that okay?
They're not picking up.
Can I hold it? How's that? All right. A history of tragedy and response, where there has been some incident, some awful incident, some tragedy, that then provokes research interest into the area. Now, while the study of aggression has been core to developmental psychology since the 1890s, the study of bullying really emerged more in the 1970s, 1980s, and it had a lot to do with Dan Oveas. There's Dan. Dan is not only a fantastic researcher, he is a recorded jazz pianist, and what's funny about Oveas is that in 1982, there were suicides in the country of Norway, and the Norwegian government wanted to implement an anti-bullying policy everywhere, in every school, at a time when bullying was terribly under-recognized as a social problem. Now, the irony of the Oveas work is that Oveas had written a paper, a long paper in 1979, it was published in a journal called Psychological Review, where he surveyed many, many studies and found that aggression was about the most stable human characteristic there is in terms of change over time within the individual. It was second only to IQ, that aggression is terribly hard to change. Aggression is stable over time, and kids who are aggressive at an early age are quite likely to be aggressive as adults. So despite this knowledge of the conservatism of aggression, that aggression is difficult to change, Obeas nonetheless took upon himself the task of trying to prevent and reduce bullying in schools. Now, while he was doing this, he came up with a definition that many of the speakers yesterday had referred to. Now, he didn't do any empirical research to come up with this definition. It just seemed logical to him, and he threw it out. First, an unequal power dynamic. Second, an intentional action. And third, a chronic condition, a repetitive condition. And as Professor Paltry yesterday noted, it's worthwhile thinking, I'll come back to this at the end of my talk, as to how these three conditions apply to the issue of cyberbullying. Now, of these, the unequal power dynamic is, if anything, most representative of what makes bullying different from aggression, or different from meanness. So, the idea of bullying, and the idea of unequal power, and Obeas didn't specify whether this was physical power, differences in social status. He just said it's a difference in power. And what that brought to mind to Obeas and to others who followed in his path was that there was something just terribly unfair, undemocratic, abusive about bullying. So bullying is not two people getting into a fight. It's not a hockey game. There are many instances of aggression, of meanness, of negativity that do not constitute bullying. Bullying happens when there is an abuse of power, where someone who is of lower status is being harassed by someone of higher status. Now, what that means in the cyberbullying case is interesting, and it's problematic in some ways. Now, what I have focused on myself, and this is a book we put out a few years ago, is what happens when aggression is popular. So we all know that aggressive kids, many aggressive kids, are rejected. They're disliked by many because aggression is inherently dislikable, and they're liked by few. But not all aggressors are like that. So the paradox of aggressive behavior is that in some ways it's like light, wave and particle, simultaneously adaptive and maladaptive. The maladaptive, dysfunctional aspects of aggression are clear enough. They cause harm to others. It reduces life chances for the aggressor and opportunities. At the same time, aggression is a highly evolved behavior. There's a reason why aggression is still part of the human behavioral repertoire. Aggression is used to acquire resources. Aggression is used to maintain and increase status. So aggression serves a purpose. And where this relates to bullying is that I think educators have to ask, what function is bullying serving for the bully? Is it just an absence of strengths, a reflection of deficits? Not always. Oftentimes, aggression is accomplishing something to the individual. Bullying is not just about physical power, but it's about social power. Being or becoming popular with your peers, being more popular than the children you harass, and it's a relationship of control. And another thing that I would like to emphasize is that we need to focus on the relationship between the bully and the victim, and not simply characterizing someone as a bully or another person as a victim, someone as someone who bullies and victims and is a victim. But it makes sense to look at bullying interactively as a relationship. Now, in the case of cyberbullying, the aggression can be even more fun. And I had the opportunity to guest lecture in a class by Professor Rhodes, Amanda Rhodes, in the zoo's own psych department, who herself has done excellent work on the popularity of aggression. And I was talking to her students about, well, why cyberbullying? Why do this? Why participate in it? Why like someone who is harassing someone else online? And they say, well, it's fun. It's like rubberneck, watching an accident, watching a wrestling match. That aggression brings social capital, social relationships, not in every case, but in too many cases. And so one thing that I've been very interested in, and it's certainly even more relevant in the context of cyberbullying, is how do social networks contribute to make that aggression adaptive for the individual who's bullied? Social networks within the school, social networks in the community, as Professor Small will talk about, and certainly social networks in cyberspace. Oh, can't see that so well. But what I've tried to emphasize in my own work is that when you think about bullying, there's two worlds of bullying. There's the bully who is peripheralized, who is rejected, who is trying to achieve status that she or he doesn't have. Then there's the bully who's connected, who's relatively popular, who has friends, who has bystanders, who's reinforcing their behavior. So when you think about a bully, and when you think about a relationship between a bully and a victim, I think it pays to think about what kind of bully is this? Is this a bully who's being reinforced by others, or who's trying to make their way into the social system of the school? These are some popular aggressive kids. You may know the guy on the left. Aggression brings status. Not in every case. An aggressive child who is popular has to have other social characteristics that promote popularity, such as athleticism, attractiveness, a good sense of humor, some sort of social skill. Yes?
Who's the man on the left? I'm sorry.
That's the heavyweight champion of the world. Ric
That's
Flair.
why I don't know.
Here's an example, as early as 4th grade. Two 4th grade boys describe how members of the popular group in their class act. Andy says, "We're always getting into trouble by talking back to the teacher. And one day, Josh and Alan got into trouble in music because they told the teacher the Disney movie she wanted to show sucked. God please slips." Tom says, "Yeah, and that's the 3rd pink slip Josh has gotten already this year, and it's only Thanksgiving." So do teachers know what the social relationships are in their own classroom? Do principals understand, or school counselors, how children and youth are related to one another in their school? Is there a school climate that is fundamentally anti-democratic because the kids who are popular or have social support for aggression? Okay, so does cyberbullying change the essential nature of bullying? Now, there's very little research, as other speakers have talked about cyberbullying per se. And the research that is done, has issues with it that I'll address briefly. One aspect that many of the speakers yesterday focused on, and that I will second, is that there's often a spillover effect, where cyberbullying is a manifestation of bullying that happens in the school or in the community. Now, there are cases, individual cases, where, let's say, a child who is victimized at school will act out online and will use the online environment to try and achieve a status that she or he doesn't have. More often, cyberbullying is a reflection of actual bullying, actual physical, social, relational bullying that's happening in the school. As Professor Walden was speaking about yesterday, there's a gendered effect, a strong gendered effect of much bullying. Commonly, we think of bullying as a same-sex phenomenon. Girls bullying other girls, boys bullying other boys. But in 3 ways, bullying crosses gender lines, particularly cyberbullying. On the one hand, well, not on the one hand, because there are going to be 3 hands here. Cyberbullying often involves social aggression, relational aggression, not physical aggression, beating someone up, let's say, on the playground or in the hallway or outside of school, although that can be the case as well. But backbiting, gossiping, excluding, humiliating. Cyberspace, obviously, given the distance involved, is crime, or social aggression that is generally more typical of girls rather than boys. Second, bullying, and particularly cyberbullying, has strong sexual themes. Epithets, anti-homophobic epithets are probably just about the most commonly used way to humiliate someone in a cyberbullying context or a bullying context. And I think that really relates directly to what Ari was talking yesterday about the effects not just on the child who is being humiliated, but on others who may share that group identity of being a sexual minority. And bullying is often directed towards sexual minorities. At some of the conferences that I've been in D.C., bullying summits, White House conferences on bullying, the 2 themes that arise again and again are, number one, the suicides, of course, that can often result from repeated, chronic, terrible bullying, and second, its direction towards sexual minorities. in kids with sexual orientations that don't fit in with whatever seems to be normal in the school culture. So in our research, this is just a little bit of data. This is a study that's funded by the Department of Education in elementary school. So we don't just ask kids, have you bullied? Or are you a victim? Kids don't really tell the truth about that, right? The victims are loath to say that they're victimized. Even reporting that they're a victim is a humiliation. And of course, any kind of self-report in psychological research is subject to lies, exaggerations. Children of all ages, when they report their own feelings, are often not very accurate. So when you just ask kids, are you a victim? This is partly why the prevalence rates vary so widely, because you don't know what you're getting. And of course, if victims are unlikely to report that they're being victimized, then bullies are even less likely to say, yeah, I'm a bully. So for instance, I usually say, I get a lot of negative journal reviews, but I rarely give them. You're not likely to admit that. Now, so what we do is that we ask kids to name not just if they are a bully or a victim, but the bullies or victims that they perceive in their classroom environment. So for instance, in this case, Cookie Monster is reported by a child to be bullying Elmo and to be bullying Shrek. So we get a relationship between a bully and a victim. And when we do that, that didn't turn out so well. What we find is many bully victim dyads, 42%, involve a boy harassing a girl. So bullying that crosses gender lines is endemic, and this is in the elementary school context, prepubescent children. We also find, I don't have a slide on this, that children, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade children, are able to reliably report and have consensus, not just on who is the bully in their classroom, and not just who is the victim, but who is bullying who. And it's only by having that relationship between the bully and the victim that you can really assess what kind of power imbalance that there is. There's also a very strong social network effect when it comes to aggression and bullying. Aggression is a contagious behavior. Aggression spreads like wildfire, and aggression spreads along social connections between human beings and non-human beings as well. In cyberbullying, the social network is so much more complex, and aggression can move so much more quickly and spread so much more widely. So this is another little piece of data from an elementary school classroom. The boys are in blue, the girls are in red, the black lines are friendships. I name you as my friend, you name me as my friend. The red lines are bully-victim relations. And you can quantify some of the indices that are involved here, but I would just want to show that bullying follows a pattern. Right? This kid is victimized a lot. This kid also bullies other kids. So you can think about the spread of bullying over time. So in our study, this is just one point in time, but we actually work with kids 3 times over a school year. And we can track how bullying changes and spreads in the social network over time. Theoretically, the same can be done with a cyber network, although obviously the nodes and the lines are much more complex. But through this way, you can begin to track how bullying begins and how it spreads. This is a nice little long quote, but a nice quote from one of my mentors, Bob Cairns, from the University of North Carolina. He passed away a few years ago. What he said here is that once hostility and aggression become significant components in the lifestyle of individuals, or become woven into the coercive interchanges, relationships of a family or a group, it gains a stranglehold. For the bully, opportunities are lost due to problems created by hostility, including grade failure, school suspension, and expulsion. And future constraints are created, and further constraints are created for future choices and opportunities. And the second part I would especially want to emphasize. That effective intervention and prevention programs have to attend not only to the characteristics of the person, but but also the characteristics of the social context, the social network, the school climate. Support for aggressive and violent behavior beyond the person has to be changed in addition to whatever changes are effected within the person. Aggression operates with a social network that's endemic to classroom climates and school climates that are dysfunctional. Finally, teachers and other educators feel very uncomfortable with cyberbullying. There's little knowledge and fewer guidelines. I think Mr. Laramie will be talking about that later, about how schools seem just very ill-equipped to deal with bullying and particularly cyberbullying. They don't know what to do. So we need more education for adults and an integration of cyberbullying into general bullying policies. Results from NEA, that's the National Education Association. This was done by Catherine Bradshaw at Johns Hopkins University and some of her colleagues, where they surveyed 20, 30,000, huge number, I don't know how many, teachers and other para-educators, school bus drivers, school counselors, janitors, about what they know about cyberbullying and how equipped they feel to deal with it. The numbers are horrifically low. No one knows what to do. And I think the question from the school principal yesterday, in a way, is an example of that kind of lack of comfort, familiarity, guidance with how to deal with bullying in their schools. A colleague of Professor Donald Goodnow in the Wake Forest Law Review tried to put forward, this is just last year, I believe, a model policy of how schools can deal with cyberbullying, which is similar to what was presented yesterday. And part of what is interesting about that is that with cyberbullying, there's not so clearly always an inference of intent, but there's foreseeability, and there's negligence in knowing, even if you don't intend, that emails and tweets and Facebook posts are going to be repeated and used over and over again. So you may not, as the bully, as the cyberbully, intend to have your post, your humiliating comments spread all over the world, but in a way, it is very foreseeable. Let me go back to a point that I made before. The research designs in bullying, in normative bullying, and particularly in cyberbullying, are very poor. Studies that have to do with cyberbullying, they just ask kids, have you been cyberbullied? And how often have you been cyberbullied? Actual use of technology, looking at archives, for instance, of communications between kids. That's never done, or it's not done yet. You have to go beyond the anonymous self-survey, because that's going to give poor information, wildly varying estimates of the prevalence of bullying and cyberbullying. And so questions that we all have, what are the effects of anonymity, of not being in proximity to your victim, the disinhibition effect of being away from the actual person that you're victimizing? It makes sense that this will, make cyberbullying more prevalent, but there's not any data on that. Similarly, are long-term effects worse for victims of cyberbullying because the internet does not forget, because these posts and these comments maintain themselves over time, whereas in traditional bullying, the bullying ends when the perpetrator is removed. What are the effects on that? I think psychological adjustment. We can infer, but we don't know. And certainly, analyzing the spread of a cyberbullying incident is another topic for research that hasn't yet been done. Really, right now, the research is limited to just asking kids, are you a cyberbully? Are you a cyber victim? And these measures are correlated very, very high, 0.8, 9, with kids' responses to are they a bully or a victim. And even those responses have great flaws because kids are making stuff up. What do we tell educators and parents? We'll go through this a bit quickly. You have to ask students about bullying before bullying happens. You have to ask students about their relationship. You have to build democratic classrooms and school climates in an era of limited resources, in an era where teachers are underpaid and feel undervalued, it's difficult to have the kind of caring community that you need. Now, there was a case, which is a New York case, TK and SK, against the New York Department of Education. This is from April 2001. And the Judge Weinstein, he wrote, current legal theories and approaches to bullying suffer from a common flaw. They view bullying from an incident-based perspective rather than from a school culture perspective. They focus on what school officials knew about a specific bullying incident rather than addressing what school officials have done to ensure a culture where bullying is unacceptable. We find in our research that when you have a peer ecology, where there are a couple kids who are popular and many kids who are unpopular, a hierarchically organized classroom environment, that in those kinds of classrooms, aggressors tend to be much more popular than in classrooms where kids have a relatively equal distribution of social status. So bullying is endemic to a classroom culture. And that classroom or school culture can be functional or dysfunctional. It can be one where aggression is essentially promoted, or one where aggression is not popular. And there are a lot of anti-bullying curricula out there. Some have more research than others. Quick parting thoughts. Intentionality, repetition, power imbalances, all to some extent have different meanings in cyberbullying. And as Professor Paltry mentioned yesterday, a very important task, I think, for lawyers and for researchers is to think carefully about what this means in the electronic context. What does a power imbalance mean when you're not in physical proximity to your victim? Cyberbullying and bullying are gateways for one another. There's a spillover effect between them. They're not really separable phenomena in terms of the relationships between each other. Cyberbullying involves gender in many, many ways. And to think about bullying as it's commonly done as simply a same-sex phenomenon is you're going to miss a lot of the bullying incidents that happen in your school. Aggression is a contagion behavior that operates through social networks, and this becomes more central still in cyberbullying. Finally, as many of the speakers mentioned yesterday, along with having more education about what cyberbullying entails, although here, kids are always going to be one step ahead of the adults. The problem of cyberbullying, the problem of bullying, is fundamentally a problem of morals and character. And until that is fixed, until aggression is not seen as popular, then you're going to have problems in schools. And so part of the issue, as Professor Palfrey was talking about, is to have social emotional learning programs and other curriculum that teach kids skills about how to appropriately relate to their other fellow human beings. In that way, we help to build this kind of democratic environment where all kids get a free and appropriate public education. Thanks very much.
Hello. Okay. I'm not used to holding a mic. Okay, well, thank you, everyone, the co-chairs and the staff in the law review to put this symposium together. It's been extremely informative thus far, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm just curious, I know there are many people from the law field here, but is there anyone from the school-based setting, educators, clinicians, that sort of? Oh, okay, there's actually a fair number, more than I would have expected. Thank you, that's helpful. So I think I'm coming here from a slightly different background, similar in some ways to Phil, but certainly quite different from the law background. And I think that's really sort of shaped and informed my research. So I'm a counseling psychologist, and I think part of the way I think about cyberbullying and bullying generally is informed by my experiences working with individuals with multiple victimization experiences. That's where a lot of my clinical work has been done. And so in part today, I'll be talking about how I'd like to think about cyberbullying or traditional bullying in the context of other experiences individuals have had. I think that's really important from multiple perspectives, whether it's prevention or individual counseling with a particular child. Second, I think what guides my research more broadly is the socio-ecological framework, which is very familiar to those of you in more psychology or perhaps education fields, but maybe less familiar to the law field. But essentially, it's a model set forth by Bronfenbrenner that talks about an individual being situated within a series of nested contextual settings. So there's the child within a family, within a school, and all of these things contribute to the child's functioning and well-being. And I think in terms of thinking about victimization, we can think of this similarly in that you have the child who might experience victimization or perpetration within the family, and then similarly within the peer group, school, community, and so forth. So I think that also informs my work. Also, prior to Boston University, I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the Division of Violence Prevention, specifically focusing, there are so many layers within the government, so then within that, I was focused on youth violence and sexual violence prevention. And I think a lot of what some of the discussion centered around in terms of prevention was, to what extent do we need programs specifically targeted at, say, bullying or sexual harassment or anything like that? Or can there be this spillover effect? That is, we can take multiple risk behaviors and somehow interweave components in prevention that would address many of them. And I think for educators in the audience, you can recognize why, if this is the case, it would be particularly relevant and important for school settings to know that, with so many demands on educators, if there could be some sort of program that could address multiple issues, that would certainly be helpful in terms of a time perspective, a financial perspective, and all of that. So that's sort of, I guess, a brief background about where I am coming from with this. And it's early, so I thought we could start with a cartoon. This is Milt Priege. I'm not actually sure, correct me if I'm wrong, if that's how to pronounce his name. But it shows a child in a classroom. And in the way I see the cartoon, there's perhaps the teacher and the parent there. And one of them says, he said he's afraid to go home because that's where the computer is. To me, this also illustrates why cyberbullying might have a particular effect on psychological functioning, to the extent that you can't escape it, right? If you're a victim of traditional bullying, you can have a terrible experience within school, but perhaps go home and maybe your environment in terms of the neighborhood is better and you're not a victim there. But with cyberbullying, you really potentially could be victimized 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I think to me that helps think about why potentially psychological or emotional effects are different or perhaps could be heightened for individuals who experience cyberbullying. And again, as others, including Phil, have noted, I think we do need to keep in mind that obviously some of the cyberbullies are also a fair amount experiencing traditional bullying. So what do we know? I thought I would sort of give a brief research summary, and I should warn you, my talk will be very data-driven after this, so I hope it's not too early or too much to be doing it. But I'll be mainly talking about a study I've done that relates to psychological functioning. So in any event, from the broader literature, I should first note, as others have, that we know a lot less about cyberbullying. It's a newer field. It's just been studied less. So I think in terms of psychological functioning, there just aren't as many studies out there as there have been with traditional bullying. That said, I think that some of the psychological and educational correlates we see are very similar to what we would see in a traditional bullying environment. So you can see the list here, ranging from poor academic performance, depression, general psychological distress, low school commitment. Importantly, it's also linked to other externalizing behaviors that are risk behaviors like alcohol use and smoking. And if you ask in a study by Janice Wallach and colleagues who are at the Crimes Against Children Research Center, where I was before CDC, that's my pathway there, adolescents really feel like these incidents are upsetting, frightening, embarrassing. A fair number will characterize internet-based harassment in those ways, and they're very stress-inducing. And I think, as we see with the picture, in rare cases, cyberbullying has, at least retrospectively or anecdotally, been linked to suicide. And I think that's something that the press and maybe the public has this impression of, that it's linked to that, although clearly that would be in rare cases. And I think it's hard looking back to say what really contributed, particularly if you're taking my framework of these multiple factors really contributing to a youth's functioning. I should also note, again, I think about design and data. Most studies, as is actually also true with bullying, are cross-sectional. That is, they're asking kids at a single time point, were you bullied, were you cyberbullied, and what's your psychological functioning status? And so that has its limitations in that we don't know. Is it that depressed children are more likely to become victimized in cyber environments, or do cyber environments promote depression among children who might not have been depressed previously? So it's complicated, and obviously there could be a bit of both. So in terms of then what we know about, too many things to hold here. What do we know about how traditional and cyberbullying might similarly or differentially relate to psychological functioning? And I think there have been some different perspectives on this from panelists, but I think there is some evidence that there could be some distinct associations with cyberbullying. I don't think we know yet, but I think that this is possible, and that patterns are often different. So for example, there was a study that Wang and colleagues published very recently. This was a nationally representative survey of youth in the United States, grades 6 through 10. And victims of cyberbullies reported more depression, victims of cyberbullying reported more depression than cyberbullies or cyberbully victims. And this pattern was not the same for those involved in traditional school-based bullying. That is, for the traditional youth, victims and bullies and bully victims were reporting more depression than uninvolved youth. So there seemed to be something distinct here in the cyber realm about those just experiencing victimization. And as a side note here, one of the things that I always think about traditional bullying is I think there is sometimes a misconception that it's only the targets of bullying that experience psychological distress, but it's quite not true in that often perpetrators are also experiencing distress. Similarly, a study of Swiss and Australian early adolescents that was recently published showed that even if you took into account an individual's experience with traditional bullying, above and beyond that, cyberbullying sort of predicted an individual's level of depression. So there seemed to be some unique component and contribution here. And finally, as many people have talked, there is this crossover between traditional and cyberbullying, and some emerging research suggests that, in fact, this subgroup of those who experience both types of victimization, in fact, perhaps are at greatest risk for psychological distress. Again, I think it's all of this is a newer area of research, but these are some of the things that are coming out. So what I'd like to turn to now, and bear with me for those of you who aren't so into data, I'd like to talk about a study, well, not really a study I've been involved with, but some findings from a data set that I've been working with. And I should note that these are preliminary findings, but this is a data set that I've been working on with Dr. Dorothy Espelage from Urbana-Champaign, where Phil's from. And I guess at the outset, given some of the comments that were just made, I should note this is a self-report survey. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a minute. So it does have its limitations. However, I think in general, maybe I feel slightly differently about self-report in that I think sometimes kids can be very honest reporters of what's going on. I think also if you're careful to use instruments that have in other settings been shown to correlate with peer report or teacher reports, you have a little bit of safety in that. And also for this particular data set, there was an effort to identify what was called dishonest responders through a variety of mechanisms, which you probably don't care all that much to hear the details about, but those people were weeded out. So I feel, even though there are limitations, that the findings, the preliminary findings that I'm presenting are probably a relatively accurate representation of what's going on. And also, as I'll note, it's a fairly large data set, so I think even if you had a small subset that still somehow ended up in there that weren't responding honestly, it would probably be slightly washed out given the numbers. So in any event, to tell you about what we did here, and this was a study that assessed a wide range of things among 9th to 12th graders from Dane County. This county was administered to all middle and high school students. And it was a very geographically diverse region, so it included rural, urban, a range of populations, and all students completed this. And the way it was administered, virtually everyone in the schools did. There was a very high response rate of students. So, and it included, again, about 11,500 students from 28 schools, and median age was about 16, about half girls. As you can see, it was a predominantly white, non-Hispanic population, which is one limitation, but there was some numbers of youth from other ethnic and racial backgrounds. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to present on this subgroup particularly today, but 9% of these youth did identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, or questioning. So that's certainly something I want to look at more, as many people have noted the rates of bullying and cyberbullying would be higher among these youth. Everyone's still with me as I go into my measures? So I feel like this is such a different audience. I'm used to the psychology conferences, and you present your data, so bear with me. In terms of, again, the kids were asked a wide range of things, but for what's important today, they were asked about traditional bullying and a number of behavioral-based questions. That is, were you teased, were you picked on, did someone push you, that sort of thing. How often do you experience that in the last 30 days? And cyberbullying. Cyberbullying, and again, I would say, in general, the limitation of this study and many other school-based studies is you want to ask a lot more questions than you can, given the time you have the students in there for. So I fully recognize that this question, there could be more questions. But basically, cyberbullying got at bullying, harassment, threats in both the internet-based environment and text messaging. Because, again, I'm interested in, well, how does cyber and traditional bullying link up with other forms of victimization? And in turn, how can we understand mental health? The children, adolescents, answered questions about exposure to domestic violence. That is, how often did they see their parents get into physical conflict specifically? Physical abuse, this was how often parents would hit, push, do physical things to them that actually left a bruise or a mark, so sort of severe instances. Sexual abuse, being forced to touch or do something sexual from an adult, and dating violence, which in this case was the extent to which the adolescents had experienced physical dating violence, not emotional dating violence here. And I think sometimes people are, I know when I present anywhere, kind of shocked that these questions are asked of kids, but I think they are at times, and you're just sort of careful about how this might affect the students' reporting. Then, of course, mental health questions were asked, and there were a range of questions here. Depression, anxiety, cutting as in self-harm behaviors, cutting your arms, that sort of thing. They were asked about if they felt they had experienced any long-term mental health problems diagnostically, if they knew they had a diagnosis. And I'll touch on a little bit at the end, this issue of alcohol and drug use, because they were asked about that. So, that makes sense? Okay. So, the first thing I want to talk about is just, well, what were their experiences? What did they say happened to them? What was the prevalence rate? So here we have cyberbullying victimization, and I've broken it out by sex here. So we have males are the orange and females are the yellow, and as you can see, the first large column is those students who said, no, that never happened to me during this past year. And it was actually the vast proportion of students said that those experiences did not occur to them. However, you do see that a fair number said it happened rarely, and then it gets lower as it gets to sometimes, often, and very often. So overall, you had 22% of students reporting cyberbullying victimization. Which again, prevalence rates can be all over the place, but given this particular item in this particular sample, this is what the youth reported. I did look a little bit about were there age differences. I know some presenters have tapped into this. There was a slight association between age and cyberbullying victimization to the extent that older youth tended to be victimized a little bit more. So that pattern existed. So then, again, one of my main focuses is on, and this has bullying in the center, but how do we think about cyberbullying intersecting with potential other forms of victimization? And I think here at bullying, but again, it could easily be cyberbullying in the middle. I've tended to just think of bullying, I think, as the nexus, as the traditional bullying. I think in the field generally, people have looked at, just bullying or maybe bullying in one other form of victimization, but people don't tend to look at how all of these experiences might intersect. And that's one of my interests here. So now I want to show you just a brief snapshot of the other victimization experiences these particular youth reported. So for traditional bullying, about half, for both males and females, reported traditional bullying experiences. And then you can see the other rates down below. The one thing that stands out a little bit to me as maybe higher than you would see in other studies is the rate of physical abuse that these youth reported. I think the other rates are fairly consistent with what you might see in other samples.
I don't want to interrupt, well, I am interrupting. So, are these students who experience bullying
Yes.
who also experience these things?
For right now, I'm showing you just overall in the sample.
Okay.
Here is, and then I'm going to go into exactly your question. That is, then among cyberbullying, how does this prevalence differ?
All right.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you for clarifying. So this is just overall sample if we don't take into account those who've been cyberbullied. Okay, so moving forward now to address your question, we found that 63% of cyberbullying victims were also victims of traditional bullying. For physical abuse, 27% reported physical abuse. This is in contrast, if you took kids who were not cyberbullies, it would be 14%, so much higher. Moving forward, for sexual abuse, 11% of cyberbullies reported sexual abuse. This was in contrast to 3% who were not cyber victims, sorry. For domestic violence exposure, 7% of cyberbullying victims reported being exposed to parents or guardians in physical fights. This was in contrast to 2.5% of those non-cyber victims. And last, dating violence, 18% of cyber victims also reported being victimized in dating relationships. This was in contrast to an average of about 6.5% of those who were not. So I'll let that sink in for a minute. But as you can see, the overall picture is that, which is not necessarily surprising, that youth involved as cyberbullies, and again, we have to remember that there is this overlap that many of them are also experiencing traditional bullying, so it's hard to parse it out exactly, but that those being bullied in the cyber environment, possibly the traditional environment, are at greater risk for being victimized in other domains. And again, this is of great interest to me in terms of thinking about, again, issues of directionality and how does this all function, and our kids who are victimized at home, perhaps presenting them in a certain way that enhances or increases their risk of victimization in school or in the cyber environment, or it just fascinates me. How do these directions work? Okay. So then moving beyond, so we now understand that yes, these cyber victims experience a fair range of other victimization forms. I'm going to turn to what do we find in terms of cyberbullying and mental health. And first I'm going to present just basic prevalence rates, that is, of cyberbullying, of those that were cyber victims, what sort of mental health symptoms did they report also. And then I'm going to move into a second analysis that looks at, okay, what about if we take into account first all the other victimization and then add on cyberbullying? Does that add additional explanation to their mental health functioning beyond, just these other victimization experiences they've had? Okay, so here we have, again, the red is no cyberbullying and the yellow is some cyberbullying. To make it less complicated, I stopped breaking it out by sex. It was too many lines. So we have, and these differences were mainly statistically significant, as you can see. Much higher rates of depression among those who experienced cyberbullying, anxiety, self-harm behaviors, students reporting that they felt that they had long-term mental health issues. And this was they were asked directly about mental health here, whereas these are behavioral symptoms. And they also had much greater rates of suicidal thoughts.
Melissa, is this slide back to the total population?
Yes. Sorry, I know I'm jumping back and forth. So this is the total population. Okay, so next what I wanted to do is look at understanding this, but in the context of all the other victimization that you've experienced, because I think that's, for me, one of the key questions. So, bear with me here. So we already said there was a significant relation between cyber victimization and overall mental health. And this is where you're really going to have to bear with me. But what was done statistically was basically, I made an overall combined sort of mental health indicator with all these behavioral symptoms, so sort of just their level of psychological distress, you can think of it as. And first, in the statistical analysis, I included all these other victimization exposures, that is, exposure to parental violence, physical abuse, sexual abuse, dating violence. And again, this is preliminary here. I'm not accounting for traditional bullying because there was a high degree of overlap, but I might want to deal with this somewhat differently after it's preliminary. And second, statistically, in the second step of this regression, I added cyberbullying victimization. So the goal of this analysis was really to say, is it just that kids who are cyberbullies, cyber victims experience distress because they have this whole other constellation of experiences, or is there something unique about cyber victimization that might explain it? I decided, unlike in a psychology audience, I wouldn't give you all the beta weights and everything like that, but I'm certainly willing to share for those of you who are interested. But the bottom line, and hopefully you can see, is that even after taking into account all these other victimization exposures, there was still some additional variation in mental health functioning that was explained by cyber victimization specifically. So we can assume that it somehow has this distinct impact above and beyond these other experiences for these youth. Everyone still with me? Okay. The last thing I wanted to do in terms of analysis was look at, well, what if we think about kids who don't have any cyber or traditional, kids who have one of them, and kids who have both cyber and traditional bullying? Because as we saw in one of the previous slides, it seemed like this group that had both experiences were maybe most at risk from a psychological perspective. Again, I did an analysis, doesn't matter exactly how it was done, but basically looking at these subgroups. And as you can see on the bottom, the outcome here again is that overall psychological distress scale, and these are means. And those who had no bullying had a mean of 3 on this scale, one form, mean of 4, and both traditional and cyberbullying were looking at a mean of 5.5 or so. And this was statistically significant. So again, this adds some additional support to the idea that if you experience both types, you're going to be at greatest risk for psychological distress as compared to experiencing just one form. So and I know there's been a lot of discussion broadly here about, is it sort of all one and the same, or is there something different about cyber? And to me, I do think the field is kind of in its infancy, but I would encourage people to think more that there could be some distinction here. There could be kids, their trajectories are just different. Maybe there's some on just the traditional bullying trajectory, some maybe just on cyber, and then some, for whatever reason that we don't quite know yet, end up involved in both. And I'm running out of time here. Just one thing to briefly show you, I mentioned that use of alcohol, because I think it's important for a variety of reasons. We're going back to the whole sample here, for those who had asked. This is everyone in the sample. Because I think that when we think about alcohol use, it could be a variety of things. It could be that this is a coping mechanism for those involved. It could be that they're already doing it and it decreases inhibition in online environments, which promotes it. The other thing to consider is, now that we know cyberbullying, have some evidence that it's related to other forms of victimization, we certainly know that use of alcohol can promote victimization in other contexts, depending where you are. So just again to highlight overall population here again, we see in the yellow are the cyberbullying, those who have been cyber victims, and the red, those who were not victims. And we see that indeed, those who have experienced cyber victimization do engage in more, use more alcohol. And interestingly, as a total side note, one of the things I'm becoming more interested in is how it also relates to things like sexual risk behaviors, and you can see similar patterns as well for that. Okay. In summary, these are points I made before, but just in closing, I think the evidence is starting to build that cyberbullying certainly has an impact on psychological functioning for some youth at least. I would still argue that we need to consider it in conjunction with other forms of victimization and not just traditional bullying. I think we need to look at the whole picture. And while here I'm looking at cyber victimization, I think often for those of you in the educational context, if we think of a traditional bully, they often have victimization experiences elsewhere as well, like I think a presenter mentioned yesterday. And I think that's really important when you're thinking about interventions and counseling with those individuals. In that, if you're counseling a bully perpetrator, you need to understand that they might also have this victimization domain that needs to be addressed. And then the preliminary evidence suggests that maybe cyberbullying, there is something unique about it that adds some distinct contribution to an individual's mental health. Why that would be, it's unclear. Is it that, when you're being victimized, it's such a context that you're isolated, you're away from others, there's no opportunity for support? That's not clear, but it does seem like there's something unique about this that we need to understand better. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I think in particular these analyses here are preliminary, and there's sort of a limited body of literature on this thus far. And I think that's it for me. Thanks for hanging with me, and thank you.
I'm going to try to speak loudly enough. Can you hear me in the back? Good. First of all, let me start my notes. I won't be the next in line to thank my host for the Midwestern hospitality. In the South, I'm from the South, we get a lot of compliments about Southern hospitality, but I have roots in the Midwest, and I can assure you that Midwestern hospitality is warmly received and much appreciated. So thank you for that. My talk is about the sort of a bridge between what's been talked about and what we're going to talk about, maybe a little bit of a bridge from yesterday too. And that is looking at the uses of the laws of behavioral instrument prevention. Specifically prevention of cyberbullying and bullying in general, which I see sort of as a subset of child welfare. I should also say thank you for choosing this as a topic. In the law, I think when I was in law school and when I talked to law professors elsewhere, children in the law often they're not given a high priority in law school. So anytime a symposium is held on how to protect harm from children, whether it's bullying, cyberbullying, or child abuse in general, I mean, I applaud that because I think there are a lot of people in the field who feel that sometimes law isn't as responsive as it should be to the needs of vulnerable populations. So I said that on my soapbox. Today I'm going to, again, talk about the limits of law as an instrument to create behavior change. And then I'm going to talk about community approaches to prevention. I mean, you mentioned one program in particular, Strong Communities, which I think is very indicative of what a community approach might look like in terms of preventing bullying and cyberbullying. Uses of laws as behavioral instruments. When we think about the law as a strategy, how it is we're going to use the law, when we think about laws capital L, typically these are general purposes. The law can regulate the markets as a way to try and regulate behavior. It can regulate information as a way to try and influence behavior. And sometimes it can impose direct sanctions as a way to influence behavior. Also, the law can act indirectly, symbolically. We'll talk first about market regulation. And I want to tip my hat first to Richard Bonney, who 25 years ago at a law school talked about different ways in which the law can be used to influence behavior. By structuring or regulating the marketplace, government can eliminate or reduce the opportunity for behavior or increase its price. Yesterday, John Coffey mentioned this briefly. He said, well, maybe we ought to think about market strategies. How could the law be used really to market, to affect the marketplace? If we think about cyberbullying as a behavior which the law is directing its attention at, we think about it as a risky behavior. We think automatically in terms of regulating the marketplace of other ways in which the law has acted. For example, requiring people to wear helmets on motorcycles, or requiring airbags by regulating the marketplace of automobile manufacturing. How does that work for cyberbullying? How is it that we can look at having the law be used as an instrument to regulate technology companies like Facebook or MySpace or those types of things? Or how might we use the law to increase the price of doing business as a bully? Or increase the price of providing opportunities for bullying behavior to take place? I don't know. I got nothing. John Coffey yesterday said, He had nothing. I've got nothing either. I do know that it's limited. I mean, I think there may be ways. There are certainly not ways. There's no willpower right now in legislatures to take a look at this as a strategy to address bullying. But this should be in the arsenal of people who are trying to think about ways in terms of preventing cyberbullying in general, and bullying in general for that matter as well. Another way in which the law works is to regulate information. Through government speech efforts are made to influence attitudes and behavior. There's some obvious limitations when the government acts for government speech. One is it has to compete with other voices. So there's a lot of channels, there's a lot of websites. Many of you, I suspect, don't often go to the government to get your news or get your information or to learn about things to shape your daily information consumption. So it's tough to compete with other voices in a democracy in America. Second is costly to use private media channels. So it's difficult to buy up time, to use. We don't have a government channel, really, in America anyway, that we listen to. And it's very hard to measure the effects of media campaigns. Governments are going to go through a media campaign. It's notoriously difficult from an empirical point of view. You don't know who got the message, what the dosage of the message is, what the base rate or baseline of behavior was before the message is there. Still, though, there are national campaigns against bullying. Raise your hand if you have heard of the national campaign against bullying. Those of you who are in bullying field can raise your hand. Stop bullying. And it's been going on, I think, for 10 years. That involved very tangentially 10 years ago. It's still going on. So the government is limited in its use here. It's also limited. Well, it makes use of partnerships often to get its message across. So the Stop Bullying campaign, for example, works with the Cartoon Network, has worked in insidious ways that you are unaware of, putting bullying scripts in different episodes of maybe your favorite TV shows. You may be surprised as to why it is bullying has suddenly appeared in a lot of ordinary television shows, drama and comedy shows. That's in part because the government has been working behind the scenes to try to influence that. The government can also regulate information by trying to influence the content of non-governmental institutions by requiring certain messages or restricting the content of private communication. As was noted, I think there are 48 state laws now that mandate that require school districts to create policies to define bullying and to monitor bullying. So that's one way in which the government can actually require messages. When I was in school, there was no messages about bullying. There was not much of an understanding of what bullying was. But now, if you're a child in school, you've probably heard about bullying. It can also operate to restrict the content of private communications. And this was the topic of a lot of conversation yesterday. And one of the challenges of that, if the government wants to get involved, is not only trying to figure out how to balance the interests within a First Amendment context, but also simply monitoring all the cyberbullying or bullying that takes place, which is an impossible task. So there's limits, I think, in using government to regulate information. The government also has within its arsenal to try and influence behavior and move people towards prevention of particular types of behavior, direct punishment of wrongdoers. So here the government can sanction or withhold benefits and privileges to which an individual would otherwise be entitled. This goes more to specific prevention or specific deterrence rather than general deterrence. If you look at the statutes, you see that there's a range of punishments. There is, on the one side, whether you're looking at in fact what's in the books or in fact what happens in schools, there might be neglect of any punishment that takes place in bullying, or there might be criminalization of what takes place in bullying. There's not much done in terms of withholding privileges. Sometimes you hear about, well, the prototypical example is the hackers who cause all this harm or prevented from ever working in the tech industry again. You don't have that in school where some kid is prevented from ever accessing or using media again. So that's not much of a strategy. So there's limitations here in terms of how effective the government can be when it's directly punishing the wrongdoer if you're looking at overall prevention. And there's a good reason for that. It's well known in psychology that when you have a high base rate of behavior, particularly illegal behavior, punishing individual wrongdoers is not likely to have much of an overall effect. So think about other illegal behaviors that are pretty normative. How many of you violated the law today, for example? How many of you drove maybe 1 mile over the speed limit on your way here today? Mostly everybody. When you think about that, and you think about other things, underage drinking, or other behaviors that are normative, it hasn't stopped. It's not much of an effect. If you see somebody pulled over on the side of the road with a cop, you need to slow down for the next 10 miles while you worry about that. Then you're back to your old normal behavior. The same is true in terms of direct punishing wrongdoers when there's a high base rate. And that's what's happening with bullying and cyberbullying. Still, it's important to punish because the law does operate symbolically. It is important for the law to announce the moral and social norms of the community. And it does so when it punishes this wrong. So that everybody knows, even though everybody's been violated, everybody knows what the law is or what the supposed conduct should be. So, in summary, we're just looking at these strategies of general prevention. There are limits to the use of the law to prevent bullying. It may be that in the future some bright minds come up with ways to use the market to regulate behavior, use information, or alter technology. But currently, there are a lot of limits to using law. So when we think about how are we going to stop cyberbullying, how are we going to stop bullying, the law may not be the best answer. It may be limited. So it leads me to think, it leads others to think, glad Prof mentioned it yesterday, to look to community-based approaches to child prevention, to prevention of child maltreatment or bullying or cyberbullying. So if you say, well, the law's a little problematic, let's take a look at community involvement. Where would you start? Well, the foundation of the legal duty to protect children flows from the moral norms of the community. So it's important to understand the community. And there is a community responsibility to children. Very few people will say that it's okay to have conditions in which children are regularly harmed. But, unfortunately, community responsibility for children has eroded. If you look at literatures, the social capital literature, for example, that's the literature that takes a look at how connected we are to one another, how connected people are to the support systems that will help them in times of distress. You find that there's these alarming trends that we're not as connected as we used to. That families, we don't have as many supportive systems as we used to. That the formal systems are not in place that used to be there. That the informal systems have weakened if you look at it in terms of trending. So community responsibility for child protection has eroded, yet we want to take a community approach to trying to create safe environments for children that children's personal security. So how is it that you build up community to protect children? I do have something here. First, it's good to look at the lessons of the past. About 20 years ago, the U.S. Advisory Board on Child Abuse and Neglect, federal task force put together, spent a couple, 18 months or so going around the country talking to all the brightest people, trying to figure out how it is to address child abuse and neglect. And these are the conclusions that came up. One, it's a big problem. People think it's a couple 100,000 cases, actually over 3 million cases reported every year across the country. So the problem is much bigger in scope than it was anticipated from most people. Society misperceives the problem. Most people think about, still today even, people think about child abuse and neglect, they immediately go to sexual abuse, they immediately go to some pedophile. When in fact, the far majority of cases are neglect. Even the physical abuse cases, only a small percentage of sexual abuse. So there's a lot of misunderstanding of what the nature of child abuse is. Third, the conclusion was that there are just a few bad parents. The perception was, well, you've got these evil parents, putting irons on the backs of kids, and that's what causes child maltreatment. If we could just figure out who these evil doers are, we could, eliminate them from the population in some way, and everything would be okay. Next, important causes are social and economic harm. That is, if neglect's a big issue, then it's not the bad parenting. It's that there's conditions we set up that allow parents, particularly if they have social poverty and economic poverty, put them at high risk for neglecting or abusing their children. So the causes are important. And most importantly, the entire system is misdirected. In child abuse and neglect, the question that triggers the system is what happened? Did abuse take place? What did neglect take place? A quick follow-up to that question is, who did it? So you have all of the system's resources focusing on did abuse take place, what should we do with the wrongdoer? And if you address the wrongdoer, then you have these two conflicting goals. Should we punish the wrongdoer? Should we treat the wrongdoer? What should we do here? So all of the energy, all of the expenses, everything looks towards the wrong. Nothing is looking at the real question, which is what are we doing in law? What are we doing as a system to prevent child maltreatment? So these are the sort of the conclusions in that literature. Now, if you look at this, you can make it's almost deja vu for me in terms of bullying, cyberbullying. What are we talking about today? We're talking about it's a bigger problem than most people suspect. We're saying society misperceives the problem. Here the misperceptions may be different. Here the misperceptions may be, when I've talked to communities about bullying, the perception is maybe it's not that harmful. Maybe this is normal. This is, I was bullied when I was a kid, and everything worked out. There are a few bad parents, maybe there are a few bad bullies. If we sort of identify them and move them out, would be okay. The important causes of bullying and cyberbullying are the environmental conditions which allow bullying to take place. But still, the system, I think, in bullying and cyberbullying is correct. Again, it's focused on the actors rather than on prevention. So if we're looking at a community approach, what should we do if the law's got limitations and how it might address the problem? Well, let's take a look at the child maltreatment pathways. The role of communication strategies to protect children. The role of community strategies to protect children. They say, well, okay, we've learned about the child maltreatment system, we want to look at the community. How can we involve communities in child protection? There's really, I think, three strategies, or three ways in which communities are involved. One is if you got a strategy to change the perpetrator, then community is seen as kind of an adjunct. You look at the perpetrator and you say, well, where in the community are resources that we might draw upon to stop this behavior or prevent it from happening? So the role of community is limited, but that's a traditional way in which social workers and other mental health professionals look at community and addressing problems. A second way you might look at the role of community is to change the system. So you're not looking at what resources are available in the community, but how these resources work together. So for bullying, you might think, well, let's take a look at the school. Does the counseling services work with the SRO or the law enforcement? Do they work with the health system? How are these integrated, or how do they understand commonly what it is about bullying victimization, and how to go about treating bullies, victims, and bystanders? Of course, you talk to teachers today and go, we don't have help in our school. We don't have a school resource officer. We're not really tied to the services. So that's changed the system. But that's still a strategy of social workers. You can try to coordinate systems or wrap around services to kids. The more ambitious strategy in terms of involving the community is trying to change community norms. And again, Prof barely touched on this yesterday in terms of how is it that we're going to change community norms. It's very difficult to go about doing it. There's a couple of programs that I want to mention briefly. One, I won't mention very much at all, because I think most of you are familiar with it, is OBEA's bully prevention program. That clearly is attempting to change norms within the school setting. It does have, as part of its strategy, this outreach into the broader community, but that's often very limited. And that's not really not the focus of the program. What really needs to be done is more of a broader social change. So I want to talk about my colleague Gary Melton has been involved in a program called Strong Communities, probably the largest scale, most ambitious program ever attempted to try and change communities in southern Greenville County, looking at child maltreatment. Again, taking this idea that what needs to happen is need to increase personal security by going and into the communities themselves. So I'll go through this briefly and then answer questions about it maybe later. the first strategy was to raise awareness of the problem, mobilize the community, increase resource availability, and then institutionalize resources. How this happened was 5 social workers were hired and were given these principles: go out, do well. Really, a lot of flexibility and creativity. Go out, learn your community, figure out who the key actors in the community are, and try and figure out ways in which child maltreatment prevention could happen. So that's a pretty broad mandate, but that's what's needed if you're looking at very diverse communities and how to change norms. Over time, they ultimately listed close to 5,000 volunteers. All the sectors were targeted. So go to businesses. In South Carolina, faith-based communities, faith-based organizations are very important. Churches, go to churches. Go to voluntary organizations. Go into neighborhood association meetings and talk to them about how it is you might organize activities to help protect children. Find out how many children are in your neighborhood. Sign pledge cards. I will learn the names of 10 kids in my neighborhood over the next year. All of these ways in which to increase connections among families and kids, and between families and institutions that will provide support services to them. So, for churches, put some bulletin inserts around child maltreatment. Have some sermons. Have one Sunday where you're going to dedicate to how it is we protect children in society. Also look to churches for volunteer recruitment. Business involvement usually started with donations, but oftentimes they were also the source of volunteers. Participating organizational involvement. So again, this is all the nonprofit organizations really fall into this category. So was it effective? Well, like good social scientists, you go out and find some comparison group within industry and you try and figure out if all of these activities made a difference. And here are listed some of the highlights of surveys done between the strong communities areas and then a control group. So you saw on these measures look like increases in indices of child safety. Fewer funded referrals to child protection services, very low base rate on that anyway, so that actually showed up. Fewer injuries. We looked at reports to emergency services. And then if you polled the kids in the communities felt safer. So that's a very important aspect of trying to create a safe environment. Do the kids feel safer in the locations that they're at? So, final thoughts. I think the law is limited, really. It may not be limited. Again, I don't want to restrict people's creative impulses here to think of brilliant ways in which to use the law as an instrument to create behavior change, particularly targeted intervention, but I think it's limited. So it's going to require the law working to create structures that are more meaningful and for more meaningful impact on our institutions, or sort of these community-based approaches. And I think that protecting children from cyberbullying or bullying should be embedded in these larger contexts of protecting children, period. And it's a lot easier to enlist people in protecting children in very specific ways if you're trying to increase connections among them than it is to go out and say, we're going to focus on this sort of cyberbullying, type of cyberbullying. But community approaches haven't really been tested, and they're very difficult to pull off for other reasons. But I think they hold the most promise for making that contribution. Thank you.
We're going to finish with brief remarks from Josh Oxenhammer. Josh is going to tell us a little bit about a movie called Bullying, which is obviously sounds relevant to what we're talking about here. He's a lawyer, a partner at Holder, Suzanne, Slusher, and Oxenhammer, but he's also president of the board of the True Falls Film Fest, a documentary festival of national renown that takes place here in Clemson in a couple of weeks. And he's also a member of the True Life Fund Committee, which awards grants to documentary films that are especially meaningful. Thank you.
I got a text that said, "How did you want to be introduced?" And I wrote back, "Incredible husband, brilliant attorney, and gifted athlete." So I said all of the rest of my remarks that I had. My name is Josh Oxenhandler. I'm a local kid and a local attorney, and I serve as president of the board for what's called Ragtag Programming for Film and Media Art, which is the downtown theater that we have, as well as presenting sponsor of the True False Film Festival, which is March 1st through 4th of this year. How many people here have heard of True False? All right, enough said about that. We have a special program that we started 6 years ago called the True Life Fund. And I'm sure that many of you, if you know of True False, have seen a documentary before, and oftentimes in the documentary you have something either very amazing or very horrific going on in your life that has caused people to want to document that. The cameras come in, the lights come on, the film is made, the producer and the director leave, and you're left with that amazing or horrible thing that you had from the very beginning. The design behind the True Life Fund is to find a way to raise money and awareness to give back to the subjects of documentaries that we believe have important social import. Over the years, last year, for example, was a movie called The Interrupters. It went on to be an Academy Award-nominated film starring one of the main interrupters, whose name was Amina Matthews. Amina and a couple of her cohort violence interrupters from Chicago came down and spent the weekend with us. The film is about an organization called ceasefire.org that seeks to take people that have been involved in gangs. Amina's father was one of the most notorious gangsters in Chicago, and help them reinvest in their community and help mediate responses at a ground level to try and prevent violence. We were able to give money to Amina and a couple of other of her cohorts to help them produce more information about ceasefire, and in fact, subsequent to that, there was a ceasefire that was started in Kansas City. A couple of years ago, on a more international scheme, we hosted a movie that was awarded the True Life Fund called Burma VJ. In Burma, which is a military-held junta, there was a counter-insurgency going on where people were taking cameras and taking to the streets to film this revolution under penalty of death. And we decided that it was important that we help affect that social change, and we were able to provide them with money to buy smaller cameras and better equipment. We don't know, there's no causation or correlation between what we're doing and that, but within about 12 months of the film Burma VJ premiering in the United States, Aung Suu Kyi, who had been under house arrest for 15 years, was released, and they held their first quasi-democratic elections there. This year's film is called Bully by Lee Hirsch. I've seen it, and as I've only seen a brief portion of what we're doing today, it's statistics and theory. This film is where the rubber meets the road on bullying. It is at times maddening and enraging and sorrowful, but you see, one of the things that I took away from it is it's injury by 1,000 tiny slices. It's not one overt thing. You see the kid walk up and take the french fries off the kid's tray, and well, that may not be something until it's happened 10 times in a row. And you see how kids don't have the basic communication skills with their teachers or with their parents to explain how this pattern continues to go until it erupts in either in a horrifying form of violence, or one of the five families that's in this film that's coming to True False, their son committed suicide as a result of what was happening in school and in his life, and they've started a foundation to help combat bullying. So our idea is to help raise money, to give to these families, to give to that not-for-profit, and to give back to that community to raise awareness. There are informational packets outside. Sean is right there to answer any questions that you have. I'm going to stick around for the Q&A if anybody wants to know anything. When our box office opens on March 1st, you can go to the box office, which is at the old Pasta Factory at Hidden Broadway, and purchase a single ticket for that, or if you have a pass, you can reserve tickets to that show. That's all I have. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, now is our time for questions, and if you have one, please come down here to the mics so that they can record the question.
actually, for Professor Holt, how did you define cyberbullying in your study? I was just curious.
Yeah. So again, I don't know again, I think it was a limited measurement, given the nature of them asking a lot of questions. Let me read it to you exactly. It was basically getting at whether they had experienced bullying, threatening, or harassment through the internet or text messaging. Okay. So it was kind of broad. I mean, that was probably the one question it could have had sort of, I would have preferred a different measurement, but that was what was asked.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things I think we've been asked a lot by administrators and school teachers is sort of, how do we figure out what's bullying and what's meanness, right? I mean, and that's,
right.
And I wonder, I mean, they say that kids know what it is. Sometimes, largely, sort of have some sense of what it is. But that's what I think we struggle with when it comes to the difference between regulating as opposed to community prevention, which I think then it's, you want to define it, but it makes sense to sort of define it more broadly there, because what you want to do is maybe, teach people to be civil as opposed to regulate civility in a much more punitive way. So I was just wondering if you had thoughts about whether students had been responding in with a really specific definition, right, of where they experience severe emotional distress.
Right. I think, and I know in terms of cyberbullying, I've done less with this, but for traditional bullying, I think often if you ask a kid, were you bullied, they're less likely to say they were than if you give them behaviorally based indicators. That is, were you teased, were you this, were you pushed? And then typically in those questions, at that point, you wouldn't be linking it to psychological distress, but rather there'd be the separate set of questions. And then ideally, I think measures are moving towards also tapping into the power differential and the other components. But so that's sort of my thoughts on the measure piece.
Okay. And then this is a question for anyone. I sort of vaguely recall, and this is a very vague recollection actually, that one of the things they said was very effective against bullying was actually getting children to stand up and respond as sort of peer. And I was wondering if there had been any further studies or any sense of, in terms of community responses, the extent to which we've talked about getting parents in communities, et cetera, but to actually getting children sort of defined as K through 12, involved in saying, wow, not cool, right? As part of the sort of bystanders.
I can just address that very briefly and then move on to others. I think bystanders are key. I think that probably Dr. Limber will be talking more about this in terms of prevention. But I think there's an increasing recognition for bullying or other forms of violence, sexual violence, anything like that you really need to involve the bystanders, and they can have a very key effect on making a difference. And traditionally, bystanders really haven't done a lot. So part of programming can be teaching kids how to intervene or what to do.
Yeah, and I think Dr. Limber may touch on this later, but the Ovea's bullying prevention program has components where kids take stands, create their own campaigns, and so you have a sort of movement within a school where kids are championing Stop Bullying Now or other types of anti-bullying messages.
See, briefly, there are homegrown efforts all across the country. You have the POWER program in Montgomery County, Maryland, where kids themselves initiated trying to change norms about bullying. I've seen theatrical productions of kids who, in a way, take the roles of children who have committed suicide and their bullies, and it's quite effective. You also have to wonder if they're modeling the kind of behavior unintentionally that others may copy. There's great potential, I think, for peer-led programs, because ultimately it's about children's social connections and children's norms. Then it's the kids who really are more likely to be able to change those norms than parents or adults. On the other hand, there was a meta-analysis that was done by David Farrington, who's a criminologist over in England, and they did a very cursory analysis, but they did find that peer-mediated programs had a negative effect, an iatrogenic effect, and it was just about the only component of bullying prevention programs that went in the opposite direction as intended. Now, I think the jury's way still out on having the kind of proper analysis of the kinds of programs that kids themselves are trying to generate.
Thank you.
read a study, or I read about a study where they said that generally Facebook and social networking and stuff like that is having a psychological impact on people who use it generally, not just children, but that people tend to see themselves as less happy than their friends because their friends have all these happy pictures of themselves posted. And I just wonder how much of that translates to children, and as parents, what can parents do? I mean, is it more harmful to limit your child's cyber exposure because of the potential social ramifications, not having all the pop culture knowledge that they could have, that peers have? Or is it better to limit their cyber exposure so that they don't have to, constantly be, cyberbullied or whatever it is? Because I know you talked about regular bullying. They get to go home at the end of the day and not see the bully. Well, can't we do the same thing? Just turn off the computer? Why is that not a solution?
Personally, as a lifestyle choice, I think it's great to turn off the computer at least one day a week and be unplugged. So there are benefits to it. I guess my first reaction is what Professor Holt said yesterday evening, is that a lot of good comes from kids using the internet. And almost every book that you read on cyberbullying that's directed towards parents has a strong component of, well, you have to monitor what your kids are doing. You have to learn about technology. The downside of that is that the parents, the adults, are always going to be one step behind. When I was in Professor Rose's class yesterday, and I was asking her students, who have some incredible technical knowledge from my own perspective, they said, well, we don't really care if our parents monitor. If my parents monitor my Facebook page, I'm just going to set up another Facebook page that they can't get to, and I'll show all the pictures of when I was driving drunk and got into an accident, and so all my friends can see. But I'm not going to let my parents see that. So obviously, I think whether it's an incident in technology or really just good old parental monitoring, knowing who your kids' friends are and where they are at what time of day, that in social development literature, that's quite predictive of kids' delinquency, just parents' knowledge of what their children are doing, what their youth are doing. So that obviously has some benefits for cyberspace as well. But I am more confident of parents' ability to know where their kids are after school than to know what they're doing on the computer. I think it is almost impossible to envision how parents will have the knowledge to outsmart their kids when on the internet there are so many backdoors and so many ways to create new web pages. If a school blocks Facebook at their school, kids can still get on it. They just create a proxy web server and boom. So monitoring is good, but I wonder if it's ever going to be effective.
This is probably a good time for us to wrap up because, we have one more? No, we'll do the one over. Let me just tell you, we're going to start the next panel at 10:30 rather than at 10:45. We're going to start at 10:30 so that one of our panelists can make a plane connection. That still gives us plenty of chance to do a pit stop and get another cup of coffee. I'll take the one last question first. No, do you want to do that? Fine?
Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll take a break. We are in recess.